Hello and shalom and welcome to another episode of Congressional Conversations, where we discuss the priorities of New York's Jewish community with members of New York's Congressional Delegation. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, the JCRC-NY. And today we welcome our very, very good friend, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Senator Gillibrand is a member, actually a new member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, a member of the Armed Services Committee, and a member of the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee, and the Special Committee on Aging. And we're so happy that you were able to take the time to be with us. Senator, thanks very much for joining us on Congressional Conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you.
Thank you. And I hope you are well and during this crazy pandemic that we're enduring. Let's start first with some personal background. For many of our viewers, of course, they know who you are, but they know who you are as a senator, maybe as a congresswoman prior to that, but maybe a little bit about your background just to start our conversation.
Well, thanks, Michael. I'm delighted to be on your show. I grew up in upstate New York. I grew up in Albany. I went to Catholic school, girls' school till high school. And then I went to a girls' boarding school called Emma Willard, which was just in Troy, New York. I went off to college at Dartmouth and got my law degree at UCLA. My first interest in politics developed in Albany, watching my grandmother be very involved in politics. She was an organizer and largely asked women to participate in politics for at least 50 years. And she'd get them involved in campaigns, and I would help her as a little girl, and really admired her dedication to public service and making sure people's views and voices were heard. After college and law school, my first job in New York was in New York City at a big fancy law firm, Davis Polk. And I was there for nearly a decade. I left to clerk for the Second Circuit, and I also left to go work for Andrew Cuomo at HUD. I worked for him for about 7 months there, and then came back to New York and joined a different firm. And from there, I eventually got up enough courage to run for office. And when I first ran for Congress, it was in upstate New York, where I'm from. I ran in the New York 20th Congressional District. Back then, it was a very red district. It was 2-1 Republican. And there was an 8-year incumbent in that seat. And I just ran on getting us out of the Iraq War because George Bush was president. I ran on oversight and accountability over the Bush administration. And miracles do happen. And I won that race, and I won re-election by a landslide, and then was appointed to the Senate. I was appointed when Secretary Hillary Clinton became the Secretary of State. And our then Governor David Paterson asked me to stand for that seat. And so I was elected 2 years later, and then re-elected 2 years after that. And since that time, I have been elected 3 times, and I have the highest vote percentage in the history of New York State.
Oh, well, that's a distinction. Actually, I remember driving up from New York City to Albany when Governor Paterson introduced you. That was one of the things that was very important. It certainly is, whoever the one of the 2 senators is going to be, particularly as an appointment as opposed to as an election. And from then, you and I started to communicate on various issues, and I'm very, very grateful for, as I said at the outset, for your friendship and for our ability to talk and in fact talk very frankly about a number of issues. But let's first start about talking about the current session, considering that the Democrats, because of the tiebreaker with the president of the Senate, who's the vice president from the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, your former colleague. So the Dems hold the Senate, they hold the House, they have the executive branch. What are your, before we get to the COVID relief issues, what are your overall objectives and goals during at least this next 2-year period and potentially beyond? Are there things that can be achieved today that weren't possible for being achieved when the Senate was in control of the other party, of the Republicans.
Yes, having Senator Schumer as the majority leader is a massive game changer. Largely, I work on a bipartisan basis, but a lot of the legislation that I've proposed over the last 8 years hasn't even gotten a vote because Mitch McConnell didn't want to vote on those issues. So in this new Congress, our biggest priority is obviously COVID relief. And so getting past the $1.9 trillion package that include money for our state budget, for our city budgets, for our community and county budgets really mattered. Money for our first responders, our teachers, our healthcare workers, our small businesses, our restaurants, our venues like Broadway, those all mattered.
And not-for-profits.
Not-for-profits covered, small businesses who didn't get money before covered. So it was a very robust, well-rounded investment in our economy and in our communities. Money for food stamps, which was something I really fought hard for. Money for training new healthcare workers so we can get vaccines into arms and get more personal protective equipment and testing done. So that's our biggest priority. The next package will be similar. It will be focused on rebuilding our infrastructure. So money for actual rebuilding of infrastructure, but also hopefully money for a national paid leave program, money for universal pre-K and affordable daycare, money for housing for the homeless and for those who are disadvantaged. That type of infrastructure reinvestment is about how do we get ourselves back on our feet and get our economy moving again, because we have a massive debt and deficit right now because of COVID. So we need to create a growing economy. So those are some of my priorities for the next bill that I will work on a bipartisan basis to get done.
Well, thank you. And one of the issues that I understand you're going to be championing is earmarks, of ensuring that earmarks are reinstated. Can you just explain to our viewers what earmarks are and why they're so important, particularly for New York?
Right. So when I first got to Congress, there was a lot of corruption. There was a culture of corruption. There was a lot of pay for play. And so one of the things that I did as a freshman Congress member was posted all my earmark requests online. So if I was asking for money for a community center or for a bridge or for a hospital, I would disclose that. I thought it was really important that my district knew what I was asking for. So if they disagreed, they could call me, talk to me, come to a town hall and say, you got it all wrong. We don't need money for the senior center. We really need money for the community garden or whatever it is. So the point is that giving the constituents the power to advocate for what they needed. I was one of only a handful of members of Congress who ever did that. And so if we do reinstate earmarks, it's essential that they are 100% transparent, that all of them have to be disclosed in real time so that sunlight can be a disinfectant and to make sure everything stays above board. What an earmark is when a congressperson or senator decides that in a certain amount of budget coming to our state, these are the 10 things that money should be spent on. The only reason it's valuable, and this is the only reason it's valuable, is sometimes the administration, whoever you're working with, doesn't know your state as well as you do, doesn't know your district as well as you do, and doesn't know what are the most urgent needs, and might be persuaded by different types of arguments. So it just allows the delegation, the senators and Congress members, to use their judgment on how a certain amount of money is spent that normally would just go to the agency, and then the administrative agency would decide how the money's spent. So it gives more discretion to elected leaders who then hopefully are listening to their voters. And so hopefully it gives the voters a bigger say.
Oh, that's very good to hear. And I hope that that in fact is going to be reinstated, and I think for the betterment of your constituency and constituencies all across the country. Speaking of constituencies in New York and elsewhere, COVID has really done a job on poverty and food insecurity in particular. You sit on the Agriculture Committee. What we have seen in New York, and in fact, JCRC has created a coalition under our Interfaith United Coalition around food insecurity, and neighborhoods in New York and in the city, inner city in particular, are very hard hit, and the ability to access food is highly limited. What can be done to address the hunger issue, as well as for our community access to kosher food?
So this has been a challenge during COVID specifically. It's also challenging during normal times, but it's been even worse. So I traveled to most of our food banks around the state, and if you're upstate, the lines will go on for miles. People will wait in their cars for literally miles. In the 5 boroughs, a food bank might have lines around the block, people standing, waiting for a bag of groceries. My focus has been to make sure everyone gets the resources and the nutrition they need. And for our kosher Jewish New Yorkers and Jewish Americans, it's really important that kosher food is also made available through the various food stamp programs, pandemic EBT, and different community kitchens, as well as food banks. And so I prioritize that as well to make sure that all of our residents get access to food. We are a very wealthy country, and I don't think anyone in this country should go to bed hungry. And so despite this pandemic and the massive unemployment that it has wrought, I'm focused very intensely on making sure that people still are fed and have the resources they need to put food on the table.
Thank you very much for all your efforts in that regard. I mentioned at the outset you were just appointed to the Select Committee on Intelligence. Why did you want to be on that committee, and what is it like working within the committee for the couple of weeks that you've been active on it?
So I've been sitting on the Armed Services Committee for over a decade. And that committee is very useful because I learn and opine on issues most urgent for our national defense and for our allies. What the Intelligence Committee does is also review what are our threats, and it has a different level of information and a different kind of information. So I thought, because New York is still the #1 terror target, and we've subverted dozens of attacks since 9/11, that I should be not only on that committee, but well aware of all the risks and all the different investments that are necessary to keep us safe. So I think by being on both Armed Services and Intelligence, I will be that much more persuasive and effective in my advocacy to making sure that we get the national security resources into New York that we need.
And that's really crucial, particularly for our Jewish community, which has been targeted time and again by terror elements. I wanted to ask you a question about cybersecurity. I know it's a key issue for you, both on the national level and as it pertains to small business, governments, and individuals. In the wake of the pandemic and the mass migration of everything to online platforms, the Jewish community in New York and across the United States has been vulnerable to both hacking attacks and the horrible case of the North Shore Hebrew Academy website defacement with Nazi propaganda, as well as many cases of Zoom bombing of religious services and Jewish events. What measures, Senator, are being taken nationally and locally to combat such cyber attacks and help institutions and individuals develop their own cyber defenses?
One of the things that I focused on for a long time is getting security grants through the UASI program, which allows for grants to be given to religious institutions, to community centers, to not-for-profits, to make sure that they're safe. And as you've mentioned, Michael, we have seen a rise in anti-Semitism exponentially over the last 4 years. We've seen the number of hate crimes increase, and the number of white supremacist groups that are anti-Semitic rise. So in addition to getting resources into the state, I'm also working to make sure that white supremacy is declared domestic terrorism, because through those efforts, we've seen horrible instances of anti-Semitism. We saw it in Charlottesville with those riots, the slurs that were used, the chants that were used were anti-Semitic and racist. So we have to fight back. And that means going after these white supremacist groups. actually arresting them and giving them jail time because they are striking terror in communities. And then making sure we have resources for education for all of our public schools to understand what the Holocaust was, why we have to be mindful of the growing hate and mindful of white supremacy. I am co-sponsoring a bill that funds that. Then I also focus on the UN because it sits in New York and it is another platform for anti-Semitism through the Human Rights Council. So I work very hard to be an aggressive advocate against the anti-Semitism that comes out of the UN and will continue to do so.
And back to my question about cybersecurity, and so much of this hatred is being spewed on the internet, and we spend so much more time on these platforms than we did previous to the pandemic. Are there any thoughts being given in the Senate Select Committee to dealing with the cybersecurity threat?
So one of the things that we will deal with on the Intelligence Committee is cybersecurity threats, as well as the rise of these hate groups and how that is a destabilizing effect for the United States and our allies. So we will address both, and we will also address those issues in the Armed Services Committee because it is, again, within the ranks of our military, the rise of anti-Semitism and racism and white supremacy is not only been identified, but has to be directly addressed. So it is something that's pervasive in both domestic issues, in foreign policy, and in national security.
Right. I remember a year ago, January 5th, on a cold Sunday morning, we walked across the Brooklyn Bridge together in our No Hate, No Fear march that we did together with UJA Federation, with New York Times gave us 25,000 participants. We think that there were thousands upon thousands more, but regardless, voices were raised against hatred of all sorts, and particularly against our Jewish community. And the nonprofit security grant is really crucial for our houses of worship. Yep. And providing them with resources, as you mentioned before. So this past year, the amount that was granted went from $90 million to $180 million, very generous. But on the House side, it went all the way up to $360 million, was quadrupled. Is there, and I know the role, of course, that Senator Schumer has played, is there a chance that in the Senate we can get approval now with Senator Schumer as majority leader and yourself on the select security, on intelligence, et cetera, to get to that $360 million mark that would be so helpful to our houses of worship?
I do. I think that we've been making the case very consistently and effectively that this is a rising need and that we need more resources to protect more houses of worship and more community centers and more communities overall. And I believe that under this administration, this is something that Joe Biden will deeply support. And so I think we will have a willing partner in fighting against anti-Semitism and domestic terrorism effectively. So I'm extremely optimistic that we'll get the support we need for all of these measures.
Thanks. You mentioned President Biden. What kind of relationship do you have with Joe Biden? How many years does it go back?
Well, I've known Joe Biden for probably 20 years, and I've been able to work with him over the last 10 in the Senate. I was very grateful during the Obama administration to be able to work with Joe Biden on some national security issues, also domestic issues of violence against women and other issues that we share in common. But I'm very optimistic that this is a president who deeply wants to affect change and to create a safer community for all of us, especially for our Jewish brothers and sisters. And I believe that he will be on the forefront of the efforts to not only protect our communities, but to stop the spread of hate that has really taken place over the last 4 years.
Oh, you mentioned, Senator, that Joe Biden has spoken out on women's related issues, and the month of March is Women's History Month. And with Kamala Harris being elected as vice president, Do you see a new era for women's rights here in America? Is it a brighter future for women than it might have been in previous years?
Definitely. I think this is a time when more women are running for office, more women are voting, more women are rising in the ranks of the business world and the not-for-profit communities. And I think it's important to have the balance. I think having male and female leaders often results in the best policy, because there's so many things that I notice as a mom and as a wife and as a daughter that are very important to my family and my community. And sometimes those issues aren't raised at all in the US Senate. And so I found that as more and more women get elected to office, more issues are raised and more solutions are offered. It's one of the reasons why I fought so hard for having national paid leave, affordable daycare, universal pre-K, equal pay for equal work. These are fundamental issues of an economy that needs to be invested in so that all workers can thrive. It's also one of the reasons why you've heard such stalwart voices fighting for healthcare, to get more vaccines, more testing, more PPE, make sure schools open safely, make sure our frontline workers have the support they need to stay in place. I think having more women in government means more time is focused on healthcare and education and the fundamentals of a jobs economy. And so, because these are the things that we see every day. So I just think if you have diversity in your representatives, you're going to have a diversity of issues and better solutions being offered because of the shared and unique experiences of each person who's being elected.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to now jump to the Middle East and to Israel. How can we reaffirm and underscore that U.S. support for Israel remain strong as a bipartisan issue? And what's the potential for U.S. re-involvement in the peace process under the Biden administration?
So this is something Joe Biden has committed to, that he wants to renew discussions of a peace process. It's something the Senate stands ready to assist and support. I routinely take delegations to Israel, bipartisan delegations, to meet with not only national security leaders, but community leaders to talk about what it would take to have a peaceful future for Israel. And it takes security assistance, and it takes willing participants in those negotiations, which haven't been readily available from the Palestinians. But it's something that I think President Biden will invest the time and effort to cultivate and to find common ground so that we can have a peace process in the future and have a future where peace is actually possible.
Yeah, and cooperation, I think, is really, really key. And also the bipartisanship, I think, is also key. You mentioned before that you like to work in a bipartisan fashion, going across to the other side and building a coalition around issues. But in terms of cooperation, you're on the Intelligence Committee, you're on the Armed Services Committee. What can be done, or is there still potential for even greater cooperation between Israel and the United States?
Oh, I think there's greater potential for even more cooperation. You know, one of the things that we can be doing is collaborating on healthcare issues, collaborating on vaccine research and development of protections for the future against the next epidemic. We're blessed that we have a lot of joint ventures with Israel and that we have a great deal of scientific collaboration with Israel. And I think those investments are really crucial long-term. We've had a great partnership with the communities within Israel as well as the businesses. And those are areas where I hope we continue to invest time and effort. And those are areas where we can not only grow support for a peace process, but also create more common ground.
Right, and agricultural technology too, agri-tech, again, you're on the agriculture.
Water technology, agriculture technology. Right. There's so much overlap, energy efficiency, green economies. green energy. Those are areas where Israel leads, and we can collaborate with them very effectively.
Yeah, we're starting something in New York around resilient cities between New York City and Tel Aviv. Again, another area of potential cooperation between the United States and Israel. Iran. What do you hope to see from the Biden administration vis-a-vis Iran, especially given Iran's malign activities over the past several years, or even greater malign activities the past several years? And what's your take on easing sanctions in that regard?
I don't think there's a lot of support for easing sanctions with regard to Iran. I think there's more of an appetite to increase sanctions given the continued investment in their missile technology, as well as their continued investment in terrorist activities. So I believe the Senate will continue to put pressure on Iran through sanctions. I also think that President Biden will try to engage the world community on whether we should have a longer term deal with Iran and what that should look like, whether that would require to have agreements with regard to ending their support for terrorism, whether it should have agreements with regard to their investment in missile technology. Those are the two things that we were hoping could have been part of the deal last time, but weren't. So perhaps now they can be part of any future deal, as well as having an agreement that is much longer in term.
Yeah, it was pretty frightening to watch on TV news the attack on a base in Iraq, the missiles coming from Iran, and I heard from military just on the news how accurate they were. If they're accurate on a short range, they potentially could be accurate on long range too. Again, America's support, U.S. support for the Iron Dome technology, the Arrow technology, the David Sling, right, technology, those are really crucial, not only to the defense of the state of Israel, but I think America is also deploying Iron Dome.
Absolutely. And, you know, our national security is fundamentally intertwined with Israel's, which is why we always want to make sure that Israel maintains their qualitative military edge. It's why I lead the letters in the Senate to make sure that the funding for that technology is always secured and not based on any other issues, that there's no litmus tests, that it is there for Israel so that we can not only guarantee their security, but recognize that they are our deepest friendship within the Middle East and the only viable democracy right now. So we need to continue to partner with Israel and stay hand in glove, because our collaboration with them makes not only Israel safer, but our allies safer, and makes this country safer. Yeah,
thank you very much for that. And I can't thank you enough for spending so much time with me on this program. I also really am so grateful for your willingness to communicate, your access. You have a wonderful team led by Patty Lubin, who reaches out to the Jewish community. And as I stated now the third time, your friendship is really so important to us. And we're just so appreciative of the role that you play. Are there any last words you'd like to share with our audience before we sign off?
Well, I just want to thank you, Michael, for your decades of leadership and your decades of friendship. I also want to recognize the work that JCRC does every day in our communities across New York, for our seniors, for those who do not have enough income for food, for those who are being left behind. I think JCRC has shown, certainly over the past year, what leadership looks like during an international pandemic. And I just want to thank your entire board and everyone who invests in JCRC for your generosity and for the unbelievable commitment to others and those who are less fortunate. So thank you so much for all you've done, Michael, and thank you for your personal guidance and advice and friendship.
Thank you as well in return. And thanks as well to our audience for watching. To learn more about some of the issues discussed today with Senator Gillibrand, you can check out JCRC-NY's 2021 Focus on Communal Priorities. This is available on our website, www.jcrcny.org. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Congressional Conversations. Thank you so much, Senator Gillibrand. Shalom to all.
Shalom.